بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I'd like to welcome you all today to this gathering, which is going to look at some aspects of our Islamic history, perhaps which we have just a very rough knowledge of. We're very grateful to be joined by Shaykh Meurad Osman, who hails from the Caucasus region. So I had to look up that word because I just assumed the word caucus, which means something else in politics and other 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 contexts, but it's actually Caucasus. He hails from that background, and obviously he has a extensive knowledge of this particular region due to his connection with it, and he's going to share some information with us today. Obviously, there's a lot to cover, so the time that we have today, we're very grateful for him joining us and sharing this with us. But there's much more to this. Volumes could be written about this region, and to be honest, I have a very sketchy idea of the particular region myself. So I'm very interested to find out more. Inshallah, hopefully, it's a means of increasing our understanding of the Muslim world, and also being able for those interested to go on and further study it. For those interested, by way of introduction for Sheikh Meurad, he hails from a ethnic background, which is linked to this particular region. He'll detail in a bit more detail about that region and its different ethnic groups. I believe he's based in the United States. He was born there, I believe, and he studied with scholars in the United States, as well as spending time in Istanbul studying at Dar al-Funun, and he's still continuing his studies, alhamdulillah, with different scholars. So we chose the title Imam Shamil because Imam Shamil is quite well known in Muslim circles. If we had Islam in the Caucasus region, it sounds overly academic, so we wanted to at least give some people a bit of a hook into the subject. And then we also have a picture on the right-hand side of Imam Zahid al-Kawthari, who many years ago, one of our teachers, Ustad Din Osman, God reward him, mentioned to me that, oh, by the way, Imam al-Kawthari is from a Caucasus region background, which and at that time I didn't have much knowledge, but at least it was some understanding that he was Ottoman, but he wasn't Turkish as such, Turkish ethnicity. And Imam Zaid al-Kawthari is one of the great figures of Sunni Islam of the last century. In any case, I think we'll hand over now to Sheikh Meurad and for him to share his knowledge with us.
جزاكم الله خيرا حياكم الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه على كل حال، حمدا يوافي نعمه يكافئ مزيده. يا رب لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك وعظيم سلطانك. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وعلى من تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. ربي أعوذ بك من همزات الشياطين وأعوذ بك ربي أن يحضرون. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank the Ustad for inviting me, and likewise all the people in attendance to give me an opportunity that I really enjoy, which is to speak about my homeland, which is known as the Caucasus Mountains, or Al-Caucas in Arabic, or Kafkas in other languages, and to share, and make more connections with other Muslims about this unique place, geographically speaking, and to foster brotherhood between other Muslim peoples, in that there are Muslims around the world and in different parts of the world that we might not be aware of, and that they have a rich cultural history that likewise we might not be aware of. So in terms of the Caucasus Mountains, the Caucasus Mountains is known as an isthmus or isthmus. I have a hard time pronouncing this word, which is essentially a region that is surrounded by water on both sides. So you can see, for example, images here, the maps of the Caucasus Mountains. The Caucasus Mountains is to the west, you have the Black Sea, and towards the east, you have the Caspian Sea. As you make your way down, you will start to reach the regions of Turkey and eventually, the Middle East. And as you make your way up, you will reach, the Russian regions, so to speak, of the continent of the area. As far as the Caucasus, in terms of the people there, the people of the Caucasus are varied in that there's a large cultural diversity in terms of tribes, in terms of different peoples, in terms of languages. Essentially, the culture of the Caucasus is uniform in that virtually all the different peoples of the Caucasus have more or less the same cultural values, very similar traditions, cultural practices that, are across the board. But what is unique about them is that although culturally they are very similar, linguistically or ethnically, they have variation. So, for example, in the Caucasus, you have, let's start from the west to the east. On the western side of the North Caucasus, you have the regions of, by the Black Sea. You have a group of people called the Abkhazians, also known as the Abazans, where my mother, her ancestors hail from. As you make your way to the east, starting from the Black Sea, you will have, for example, the Circassians, also known as the Adiga, which my father's side comes from. You have, for example, the Ossetians, you have the Karachay, you have the Balkar, you have the Ingush, you have the Chechens, you have the Dagestanis, you have just, different nations as you make your way across the North Caucasus. And each of these nations has their own tribes, their own families, their own clans, their own subdivisions. And what's unique about them is that, although virtually, like I said, virtually they all share similar core cultural values and traditions, from attire and dance and what have you, linguistically they differ, right? So the language of the Chechens is different from the language of the Circassians. The language of the Dagestanis will differ from the language of the Abazans, and the language of the Ossetians will differ from the language of the Karachay and the Balkar. Linguistically, they differ, but culturally, they are very similar. Each of these nations of the Caucasus essentially descends from various ancient nations or empires that for one reason or another immigrated or were relocated or made their way into the Caucasus. So you have, for example, the Ossetians, who more or less are the descendants of the Scythians, who are a Persian people, or the ancestors of the Persian, as sometimes it's mentioned. You have the Karachay and the Balkar, who have Turkic origins. In Dagestan, you have a mixture of Persian, Arab and Turkic origins. The Circassians, there's different opinions about where they come from. Some say they're from the Hittites, the Hatti, or as they were known, or maybe the Assyrians. So essentially, each of these nations in the Caucasus stems from another ancient people that, for one reason or another, were made their way into the Caucasus, maybe through migration, through war, through different types of reasons. And that's what makes the linguistics of that region so unique, especially the Circassian language, which is very unique. It's not really, it's kind of in its own class. People ask, is it Russian, is it is it Slavic? And I tell them, no, it's its own language. Circassians, my people, we have our own language. The Chechens have their own language. The Ossetians have their own language. Of course, with any language, there's going to be different dialects and different ways of saying certain words and different ways of speaking. But the linguistic and the cultural diversity of the Caucasus is very unique. And this is what makes the region special. As far as culturally speaking, the Caucasus is a mountainous region, right? And traditionally, the people of that area are known as mountaineers. You know, the men and women there were accustomed to living in harsh conditions. The men were expected to be strong, to be warriors, to be protectors, either due to repelling, for example, rival clans or peoples or nations or invaders. And the structure of it was such that these conditions, along with the culture, the people were expected to be very strong, especially the men. And this carries on to today. So you see, for example, many people from that region, many athletes from that region. Everybody knows about, Habib, the famous UFC fighter, but not just Habib. Many people from that region, whether they're Dagestani, Chechen, or Circassian, they are either, MMA fighters. They're either wrestling wrestling professionals. They're either in judo or jiu-jitsu. So you see a lot of that carrying on even till today, that the warrior culture is very strong there, and men are expected to, or if they are to specialize in anything, it's going to be along those lines, something that demonstrates martial skill, and athleticism in different types of fighting styles. The Caucasus itself, in its history, it has had, you could say, a turbulent history, in that towards the end of the 17th century and the 18th century, the late 1700s, the 1800s, you had Russian imperial aggression manifest itself in the Caucasus. So as we know, during the time, the 1700s and 1800s, we have different European powers trying to colonialize other areas, right? They want to, either for their resources or for their access to water or ways or what have you. Every European nation state had its own reasons for what it was doing, and Russia was no exception. So during the time of the Tsar, which is basically their emperor, their king, you have, for example, during the time of what they call Catherine the Great and Ivan the Terrible and these type of individuals, the interest and the agenda was to make its way into the Caucasus. And there's different reasons why the Russian imperial aggression was, aimed at taking the Caucasus or conquering it. One theory is that in order to reach warmer areas, right? For example, the Indian Ocean or what have you, or other areas, closer to the equator, they had to go through the Caucasus. Like we said, the Caucasus is like a bridge cutting in between two seas. You have the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and the Caucasus is essentially like a mountain bridge that you have to pass to reach, warmer areas. So one theory is that the Russian Empire, in order to reach warmer areas and have, more access and influence to those areas for whatever agenda they had to go through the Caucasus. Another theory, or another idea, was that there was some discussion about possibly the Russians wanting to retake Constantinople, because Constantinople was the capital of what they call Christian Orthodoxy. And for the Russians, who had more or less, the Russian Empire had considered itself the head or the protector or the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, they considered it pivotal in order to reach in order to take back Constantinople, according to them, to take Istanbul, they would need to acquire the Caucasus. So the Caucasus is unique geographically speaking, because it acts as a bridge between, going up to Europe and going down into the Middle East and eventually reaching Asia and other areas. So it was always coveted for its, and obviously you have the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So these areas are also very, coveted for militaristic strategic points and what have you. So as the Russians, they start to make their way encamp or make their way closer and closer into the Caucasus, you have resistance. Obviously, you have resistance from the mountaineers of the Caucasus, who have enjoyed, independence for a relatively long time, right? Not having to worry about being conquered by someone else. And their geographic isolation allowed that independence to happen. So as the Russian Empire, enters the Caucasus and tries to get a foothold there, they try different ways to, convince or have, the mountaineers surrender, right? So one way they try is to, convince them of accepting the fact that they are now under the Russian Tsar, and that they have to, according to them, the Russian Tsar is now their leader, and they have to accept that and, live their life as such. Obviously, the people of the Caucasus, being that they are not Slavs, they are not Slavic ethnically speaking, and they have a different culture and a different language, they do not accept this, right? They do not accept being ruled by someone who is all the way in a different part of the continent and linguistically and ethnically not the same. The Russians also tried to, convert them to what they call Orthodox Christianity, because they figured if they can convert them, and the Russian Empire, declares itself as, oh, sorry about that. So the second tactic that the Russians had was to try to convince or try to proselytize the people of the Caucasus into converting to Russian Christianity. Of course, by that time, the majority of the North Caucasus people were Muslims. Islam had started to reach the North Caucasus, depending on which side of the Caucasus in different times. So, for example, when you had the Muslim, Arab, and Persian conquests, this enabled Islam to open up in the Eastern Caucasus, like in areas like Dagestan and Derbent, and along the Caspian Sea region. Islam was able to come and reach the people there. And the other areas, so for example, the West Caucasus, where my ancestors would be from, the Northwest Caucasus, Islam reached us through, Ottoman da'is after the conquering of Constantinople. It was that region was the Turkish Ottoman Muslims were able to, for example, influence the region and the people there more. So there started to be some conversions there. Also, you had the Tatars, who were at that time ruling the Crimean Peninsula, and they also had an influence in the spread of Islam amongst the Circassians and the Abkhazians and the Abazins. And after that, those two regions, Islam reached those two regions slowly. You had other tribes and other people of the Caucasus, spreading Islam to other people of the Caucasus, right? So the Circassians, for example, they spread Islam to the Ossetians, and they spread it to the Karachay and the Balkars, for example. And this allowed the proliferation of Islam to be more and more. So, like we said, the Russians, they tried to use Christianity as a way to, you could say, pacify the nations of the Caucasus, but the majority had accepted Islam. And they also did not accept that as an excuse. Once the Russian Empire realized that, these people are not going to submit, and they're not going to back down, and they're not going to, have an easy surrender, they understood that they had to battle and fight these people and basically force them into submission. And you had, different figureheads of that area, lead armed resistances against the Russian imperial aggression in the name of defending the faith, in the name of defending the homeland, in the name of defending, your fellow brothers and sisters. Initially, most people, when they hear about the Muslim resistance of the North Caucasus, they usually think of Imam Shamil, rahimahullah, and that is correct. Imam Shamil was instrumental in uniting the people of the North Caucasus and leading the resistance against the Russian imperial aggression. But before Imam Shamil, there were actually other imams who had, you could say, were the imams of the resistance. The first imam that we have recorded to lead the resistance against the resistance of the Caucasus against the Russians was actually an imam called Imam Mansur. Imam Mansur, according to historical records, was ethnically a Chechen. Although he was ethnically a Chechen, he was instrumental in uniting the Chechens, the Circassians, Dagestanis, all in a coordinated effort to resist the Russians and to have this struggle against them. You had Imam Mansur, after he was exiled, captured and exiled, then the position of leadership and then to lead the resistance went to different individuals. Eventually, like Ghazi Muhammad, eventually reading Imam Shamil. Imam Shamil is unique in that he was able to, he had a vast unification process across the North Caucasus, unifying Chechens and Circassians and Dagestanis and others to resist the Russian imperial aggression. Eventually, Imam Shamil, rahimullah, and his resistance, they were not able to, completely expel the Russian entry into the Caucasus. Eventually, the Russians did make their way into the Caucasus and established a victory. However, my people, known as the Circassians, we continued to resist the Russian imperial aggression for about another 10 years after Imam Shamil's campaign had been declared ended, right? The Circassians, they continued resisting Russian imperial aggression, as I mentioned, for about another 10 years. Eventually, the Russians had realized something, in that they're not going to be able to, convince these people to give up. They're not going to be able to, convince them to lay down their arms. And the more and more effort they put into it, they realize that the Circassians are not going to win. The more and more effort they realize that the Circassians are not going to give up, right? They're just going to continue resisting. And the Circassians and the Russians had, the Circassians had been resisting Russians for about 100 years, without exaggeration. From 1763 to 1864, there was continuous resistance against the Russian, empire and their efforts to colonize and their efforts to convert. Eventually, after fighting hard and long and keeping up the resistance, the Circassians were expelled by the Russians. The Russians realized that these people are a threat to the stability, to their conquest of the Caucasus. They're not going to give up. So the Russians had basically, after killing, a great majority of them, what we consider a genocide, just killing and butchering, many villages and women and children and elderly, with the hope that the resistance fighters would give up, because their tactic was, the more people, the more innocent civilians they kill, this will, force the rebels to, give up and to stop and to lay down arms. After attacking their villages and doing what they could, eventually the Russians reached a point where, to them, for the Circassians, it was either death or exile, right? Their Russian, generals had eventually, just reached a conclusion where they said that the Russian generals had realized, the offer they gave to Tsar Alexander II was basically either kill them all or expel them, because there's no other, according to the Russians, there's no other, alternative. These people are not going to give up. So eventually what was reached was, the Russian Empire had made a deal with the Ottoman Empire. The Russian Empire had made a, treaty with the Ottoman Empire, in that they will take the Caucasus and they will give the Circassians to the Ottoman Empire. So about 90% of the Circassians were eventually expelled from the Caucasus by the Russians and were received by the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire took in the Circassians for several reasons. One, they're a Muslim people, so they felt obligated to, take care of them and take them in and provide them with safety, security. Additionally, the Circassians were, an asset to the Ottomans, in that the Circassians are a strong people, a warrior people, they're good fighters. And you see the Ottoman Empire, putting them in positions of military, putting them in positions where they want to guarantee stability and security within their own empire, like especially in the upper central region of Turkey, like Dusja, and we have the region like of Al-Kawthar. And the Circassians were also, during that time, the Ottoman Empire now wasn't just, Anatolia, it wasn't just what we call Turkey today. The Ottoman Empire was in charge of, North Africa, the Middle East. So you have the Ottoman Empire taking in a large amount of the Circassians, settling them in Anatolia, right, which is, the country of Turkey today in different regions, but also settling them in different areas. So some were settled in, what is eventually Amman, Jordan today, where there's a big Circassian population. The Circassians in Jordan were essentially, Circassians, when they first arrived in Amman, they're essentially the ones who, by them being there, it led to the capital being formed, because the area of Amman at that time was not really populated. The Circassians also, the Ottoman Empire put them in different areas of Palestine and Syria, particularly the Golan Heights, where my ancestors were relocated. And then, after that, when we reached the modern age, what they call the modern age, and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, we have Circassians who are now in different countries. So you have some Circassians who are in Turkey, some are in Jordan, some are in Syria, and these are where you'll find a great, the majority of them around the world today. You will not find the majority of Circassians today are actually not in their homeland. 90% of them globally live outside their homeland. This is due to what the Russian Empire had done, from acts of genocide and expulsion, and trying to, either kill them or expel them, because they realized they could not have them submitted. From the Circassians and from the people of the Caucasus, you have, noteworthy people like Imam Muhammad Zad al-Kawthari, rahimahullah, who was a Circassian, part of the Ottoman Empire, because, as we mentioned, the Ottoman Empire took in Circassians, and Imam al-Kawthari was Circassian. You have some other scholars who, were also from origins from the Caucasus. You have Fakhruddin Pasha, who was basically the founder of the modern Tunisian state, educated by the Ottomans, was also ethnically a Circassian. And this is eventually what happened, in that, many of the descendants of the Circassians today are all over the world. And it's a sad reality that 90% of the people are not living in their homeland, and it's because of the aggression of a foreign entity that wanted their land, wanted their geographic location, wanted their the resources they have under their feet. So this is essentially like a very, very, very broad overview of the history of the Caucasus, and what it is in terms of its cultural identity, the history. It's a very, very culturally diverse and historically significant region. So it's kind of hard to just pinpoint one thing. This is all very, very general that I'm mentioning, but if a person is interested, of course, they can, look and research, find different videos, find different documentaries or books or articles about, the history of the Caucasus, and this can help, increase their understanding of that region better, inshallah.
Thanks for that. Jazakallah khair for that. In terms of the Islamic law and the schools of fiqh, how would you break that down in terms of the?
So it's interesting, the distribution of the madhahib in the Caucasus is interesting, because, as we said, different Muslim peoples reached the Caucasus from different sides. So you have the Arab Persian Muslims reaching the Eastern Caucasus by the area of Dagestan, and by the Black Sea, by the area of Crimea, you have the Ottoman and the Tatar Muslims reaching the Circassians first, right? Reaching the Abkhazians and Circassians first, and each Muslim people from each different side was a different madhab. So on the eastern side, right, of the Caucasus, by Dagestan, like we said, it was Arab Persian Muslims who reached first, and they were following the Shafi'i school. So when that region of the Caucasus, the northeast Caucasus, embraced Islam, they did it at the hands of Muslims who were following the Shafi'i school. So by extension, they became Shafi'i, and the other Muslim people they influenced within the Caucasus also became Shafi'i. So that's why you have Dagestanis, Chechens, and the Ingush, who are, on the eastern side of the Caucasus. They are majority Shafi'i, right? On the western side of the Caucasus, you have the Abkhazians, the Abazins, the Circassians, the Ossetians, right? The Karachay and the Balkar. They are actually Hanafi, right? They are predominantly Hanafi. And this is because the Muslims that reached that region first were predominantly Hanafi, from whether it's the Ottomans or the Tatars. And so once those people embraced Islam, according to the Hanafi school, they also, spread it amongst their people, amongst their tribes, amongst their families, also according to the Hanafi school. So then the Caucasus Mountains, if you go down the middle, on the east side, it's Shafi'i, on the west side, it's Hanafi, right?
And in terms of tasawwuf, I mean, the impression I get is that it's just part of the DNA without people actually realizing it. Would you be able to share some?
So tasawwuf, that's a very good point. Tasawwuf actually played an important role in the resistance against the Russians, right? You see this, for example, in different turuq, they actively did play an active role in resisting colonial powers in North Africa, in different parts across the Muslim world. So when it came to the Caucasus, the tariqa that was instrumental in resisting the Russian imperial aggression was the Naqshbandi tariqa, right? The Naqshbandi tariqa, its presence in the Caucasus was more so, reached there first, you could say, and it was successful. It reached, it was probably predominant amongst the Dagestanis, the Chechens, and some Circassians. So the Naqshbandi tariqa was the tariqa that was, part of the resistance effort against the Russian imperial aggression. After that, after the Russian, the Russian imperial aggression, after Russia had, basically conquered the Caucasus or won, and the resistance ended, you had different tariqas that reached that area. So eventually you had, for example, the Qadiriyya, the tariqa Qadiriyya that became influential, particularly among the Chechens, right? Those videos, when you see those brothers, doing dhikr and moving together in a circle, this is not traditional Naqshbandi dhikr that was practiced in the Caucasus for a very long time, but rather this is a tariqa that came later, a branch of the Qadiriyya, by a righteous man, a wali known as Kunta Haji, rahimahullah, and he brought the Qadiri tariqa to the Caucasus. But initially, the Naqshbandi tariqa was the tariqa that was in charge of resisting, the Russian imperial aggression.
In terms of the Soviet Union period, would you be able to share some information about that? I mean, how were those areas treated? Was it tolerated, Islam?
So the during the time after the fall of the Russian Empire, after it went from being a Christian Orthodox, Slavic empire, it became known, as we know, it merged or fell into what was called the USSR. Officially, the USSR was atheist or against religion, and they cracked down very hard on religious practice, not just in the Caucasus, but all across their territory that they had acquired when they were Russian Empire. So it was very difficult to practice one's Islam, one's religion during that time. Masajid were closed down. Religious scholars were, either imprisoned or executed or exiled or, defamed, so people wouldn't listen to them. So it was very hard for, religious practice during that time, especially at the peak of the Soviet time. Eventually, as the USSR starts to weaken or starts to dissolve, or religious practice has resurfaced. So in the Caucasus today, alhamdulillah, Islam is very strong there. In Islam, there are many masajid, there are ulama, there are schools, there are, halal restaurants. The majority of people there consider themselves Muslim. The majority of themselves there hold on to their faith. So that weakening of the USSR, it was actually very good for the practice of, the Islamic faith. That way people could, practice it without, repercussion. But yes, during the Soviet time, it was difficult. And I've heard different stories of people whose either parents were alive during that time or ancestors were alive during that time, or might have been alive during that time, talking about how it was very difficult to practice one's religion during that time. And most often than not, religion was practiced privately or secretly during, that turbulent time of the USSR.
And has that still has its remnants? So, for example, I noticed a lot of the names are still Russian, like Russian style names. Is that, do they use like two different ways of saying their name, or how does that work?
Yeah, so obviously, because the Russians eventually conquered the Caucasus, they were able to culturally influence the people there. So officially, the language there is the Russian language. There are and the Russian Empire, when they did conquer the Caucasus, they did intentionally put their settlers in that region. So especially the Cossacks, right, who are basically the mercenary force or the army force for the Russian Empire. They intentionally did put Russian settlers in these regions they conquered to weaken the people there culturally and linguistically, and to make their culture and their language dominant. So yes, I mean, obviously it is very sad, but the Russians did do that intentionally to put their language first and their culture first. So that's why you see a lot of people from that region. The majority of them speak Russian, and many of them unfortunately don't know their native tongue. Many Circassians don't know Circassian, and many people from across that region might not know how to speak their native tongue, the tongue of their ancestors, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that's why you see, for example, a lot of last names have "of" at the end of it, right? "Of" is essentially like how we have in Arabic the "ya" of nisba, right? Like Masri, Sharkasi, Albani, Suri, Urduni. That "of" at the end is just that attributing yourself to that place or that clan or that family. So yeah, you do have culturally, the people there are heavily affected by Russian, influence, because Russia has been in possession of the Caucasus since essentially 1864, right? And that's basically what's happened.
In terms of today, I was speaking to someone recently, and I wasn't aware, but he said to me, I live in Tatarstan now, and he didn't say Russia. So do the people there kind of think of themselves as being a country, as opposed to, we would regard them as Russian. Oh, you're Russia, in
Yeah,
Russia, but
yeah,
they actually think they're part of a federation, so they have their own president, and they don't really
yeah,
view themselves being as part of a Russian country as such.
yeah. I mean, obviously, as a Circassian myself, for someone to call me a Russian, this would be an insult, right? Because that's to deny my ethnic and cultural and historical uniqueness, right? Now, yes, you do have, and now in Russia, you have many different ethnicities, right? You do have the Slavs, right, who are, the dominant, you could say, ethnicity there. But you do have people from Turkic, Tatar, Caucasus ethnic backgrounds as well, right? So for these people to say you're Russian, is like, it's as if I'm denying my cultural uniqueness, right? To say a Tatar, to say he's a Russian, it's for him to, that's like him denying his cultural heritage, his language, his history. Now, yes, in certain regions of the Russian Empire, they do kind of have like a semi autonomous autonomy, if that makes sense. Like there is some level of independency, but it's, for many people, it's not what we really want. Many people of the Caucasus, especially many Circassians living in diaspora, such as myself, we would love to have an independent Circassian, independent nation that is not part of Russia, where, Russian is not the dominant language. We're not under the Russian Federation. We have our own language, our own culture, and this is what makes us unique. So definitely, I can imagine people from that region, or Tatars or anyone from the Caucasus, they don't like the idea of being called a Russian, because it makes you deny your cultural history and your uniqueness.
And in terms of tasawwuf, how influenced is the culture of the region by tasawwuf and practices? So, for example, the average person, they might not know the word tasawwuf, but they're actually quite, they maybe practice a lot of it without knowing so. Is that the
Yeah.
case? So,
I mean, like I said, definitely Tasawwuf had a prominent role in the resistance of the Muslims of the Caucasus against the Russians, particularly the Naqshbandi Tariqa. So there might be many practices or many things that were done that are part of maybe the way of the tariqa that they might not be aware of. But for example, they see, my grandmother, my grandfather used to say this or do this, right? Now today, the majority after that period of tasawwuf before the Russian Empire had won, after the conquering of the Russian Empire of the Caucasus, and after the USSR had tried their best to do away with any type of practice of religion. Now, after the fall of the USSR, you have a resurgence of people who want to rediscover their faith, learn their history. So you have an interest in tasawwuf as well, because tasawwuf is part of that region, right? So you have people who, maybe want to, learn about what tasawwuf is. And they, the scholars of that region talk about tasawwuf and they mention it. So now there is an interest to go back to the roots of that type of practice, of tasawwuf and things like that. So, it's not surprising for people to, once they rediscover their faith and realize, hey, my ancestors used to be Naqshbandi. That makes them interested in learning the Naqshbandi Tariqa. My ancestors used to be Hanafi. That makes them interested in learning the Hanafi school. So these type of things, after the rekindling of their faith and learning their religion again, yes, it does lead to them having an interest in tasawwuf and learning about the prominent role it had in their history.
I've got a question here about Imam Shamil. So it mentions that after they being defeated, they were exiled to Russia, the actual Russian mainland itself.
Yeah.
Do you have any further
Yeah, so after the Imam Shamil's campaign had ended, the Russians did respect him. Obviously, he was, resisting them, and he was an enemy, but they did respect him as a commander, as a general, as a leader of his people, rahimahullah. So they did have Imam Shamil, rahimahullah, brought over to St. Petersburg, where he did meet the Russian Tsar. He did have an audience with him and, the Russian leadership at that time. Eventually, he was placed, under house arrest and these type of things, but he had requested, due to his age and due to his, he's getting closer and closer towards, the end of his days. He requested, that his exile be at least he'd be allowed to make Hajj and go to, Istanbul, Mecca, Medina. Obviously, the Russians didn't want any further militaristic resurgences, but they obliged to this request of Imam Shamil that he be allowed to make the Hajj, he'd be allowed to go to Medina to Munawwara, and that's where Imam Shamil is now buried. He's actually buried in Jannatul Baqi, in the city of the Prophet ﷺ, in Medina to Munawwara. And this was after he was brought to St. Petersburg, and after he met with the Russian Tsar. He requested that he be allowed to make the Hajj and make, the pilgrimage, and he was obliged, and eventually he passed away in Medina to Munawwara.
I'm just going to open up the questions. If there's any questions, we'll give it a minute or so for questions. If not, then we can have a concluding dua. If any questions, please share them in the chat. Okay, I don't think anybody's typing anything, but alhamdulillah. Oh, is it possible to find Imam Shamil's grave? Shakib, is that another Shaykh, possibly?
I'm assuming it's Imam Shamil. So we know Imam Shamil is buried in Jannatul Baqi. This is confirmed historically. Me personally, do I know where it is? I do not. As we know, after the Wahhabi taking of the region, they did destroy many structures and many type of indicators of where people are buried. So I personally, I've visited Jannatul Baqi, alhamdulillah, and inshallah we all are unable to do so. But I was not able to, as with many of the notable personalities that are buried in that blessed graveyard, I was not able to know where Imam Shamil was buried. So what I do is, I know Imam Shamil is buried there, and I know that other notable personalities are buried there, and I make dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them mercy and forgiveness, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge suffices as to, where exactly they are. And, but I can tell you, definitely if you go there, you're going to know where the grave of Imam Shamil is, but you can be rest assured he is buried there, rahimahullah.
There's another question. Of the Cossacks that settled in these regions, did any of them accept Islam due to the military strength and heritage they came from? And similarly, they saw with the Muslims. What they saw with the Muslims.
So the Cossacks are traditionally very zealot in Russian Orthodox Christianity. They're very zealot in that particular, in their faith. I never heard of any examples of them converting to Islam. It is possible that some of them may have converted to Islam and become Muslim and lived and settled alongside these Muslim peoples of the Caucasus. Wallahu alam. I personally never heard of any cases of that, but it is possible that could have happened. But overall, Cossacks are known for being staunch defenders of Russian Christianity and the Russian Empire.
And are there any descendants from Imam Shamil's family or carrying on that heritage, or is that not really?
Are there descendants of yeah, are there? I mean, there are still descendants of Imam Shamil. Imam Shamil did have children and did have grandchildren and did have people who are his descendants. Are there descendants of his who are leading any type of
more religious, more in the religious sense, like religious?
More in the religious sense. I personally don't know. I know there were descendants of his that did live after him. But I never heard of a case of someone being a Shaykh and a descendant of him. Wallahu ta'ala.
And in terms of scholarship at the moment, within studying within that region, do they have schools which are of a very high caliber? So, for example, in Shafi fiqh, do they have their, because the Indo-Paks have their own particular version of Hanafi fiqh. Is it right to say that they have their own kind of iteration of Shafi'i fiqh and Hanafi fiqh then, where they will differ with the Shami scholars and say, well, no, sorry, in our region we do it this way?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, after the fall of the USSR and after, religion had been banned for a long time, a lot of people from that region of the Caucasus did go to other regions of the Muslim world to study. So some of them did go to Turkey. I know some went to Libya, some went to Syria. I can tell you in terms of the Circassians, a lot of them did go from the Caucasus. They did go to Syria to study. And I guess what you can conclude is based on the curriculum they learned there, whether they took a Shafi route or a Hanafi route, they brought that back to their people and, used those books or those, recommendations of their teachers in terms of what they're going to teach and the curriculums they're going to use, right? Now, there could be, maybe documentation. They do know what the books they used to teach in the Caucasus before the Russians came, and they do know the kutub, and they do know which curriculum and manhaj they should use. But I know that a lot of them did go overseas to study. I know for our people, the Circassians, a lot of them did go to Syria because Syria has a lot of Circassians after the exile. So probably whatever they learned in Mahad Fath al-Islami or Mahad Abu Nur or whatever scholars they study with, they took those books and they brought them back to their people, teaching those books in that curriculum they had.
The other question is, any descendants of Imam Shamil that are leading revival of Muslim independence in the region?
Not that I know of. I know that Russia is very, very paranoid about any type of secession or any type of, hint of revival of secession of the Caucasus. But I don't know of any cases about this per se. No.
There's a question. I saw a program recently that documented the tension between the traditional old and new due to Salafi influence in the region.
Mm-hmm. So there, after the fall of the USSR and people's religious revival had begun to research, you do have, for example, some individuals from outside the Caucasus coming to the Caucasus with a Salafi background. And you might have some people who after leaving the Caucasus and studying in a different place, studied at a Salafi area or institution, thinking that this was, the most appropriate form of learning or Islam. So definitely there is some tension between, the traditional Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah outlook on how learning and teaching Islam, which is, the four madhahib, the Shafi'i school, the Hanafi school, the Maliki school, Shafi'i school, the Ash'ari Maturidi school, the traditional way Islam has been practiced, as opposed to this, modernist Salafi understanding of the religion. So yes, there are some individuals who came from outside the Caucasus to the Caucasus with these ideas, and there were some people who did study these ideas that were from the Caucasus, did study these ideas and then bring them back. But overall, I mean, historically speaking and culturally speaking, it's usually the Shafi'i or the Hanafi school when it comes to Islam, the practice of Islam in the Caucasus region.
And in terms of the Sufi tariqas, have any of them survived intact with actually a proper Shaykh? Because, or did it become criticized where...
You do have, for example, in the Dagestani region, you had Shaykh Sa'id Sharkawi, rahimahullah, who was martyred a couple of years back. He was part of that traditional Naqshbandi tariqa that was practiced in that region for a very long time. You do have some elements of, as with wherever the practice of tasawwuf happens, you do have charlatans, you do have fake people, you do have people without a sanad or who don't have a strong foundation in aqidah and fiqh. And they end up making things worse for other people than actually making things better. But I do know, in terms of the Naqshbandi tariqa, as is practiced in Dagestan, you do have Sheikh Sa'id Sharkawi. Like I said, he passed away, but his Khalifa, his students are still active there.
And you would regard them as being ulama and upon the Sharia and...
Yes.
So learned people.
Learned people, yes. People that have a foundation in the Sharia, essentially, right? Because all the big figureheads of tasawwuf have always stressed and maintained that tasawwuf, we are Sharia-based tasawwuf. We are not a tasawwuf that goes against the rulings of the Sharia and goes against aqidah,
And just on that note, does Shaykh Mahmoud Effendi still have an influence in that region? Because I know they had people coming from that region to study with them.
Shaykh Mahmoud Effendi, rahimahullah, I know, I can't say for exact how influential the region was. Shaykh Mahmoud Effendi, if you look at his teacher, Shaykh Ali Haidar Effendi, rahimahullah, Shaykh Ali Haidar Effendi was ethnically a Georgian, which are going after you leave the North Caucasus and go down, right, towards your way to Turkey. There were some scholars that from the North Caucasus that came to meet Shaykh Mahmoud Effendi while he was alive, rahimahullah. And I'm aware of that. I'm aware of scholars being aware of him. As for how influential Shaykh Mahmoud Effendi, rahimahullah, himself was to the Caucasus, I know he was aware of, when the Chechen War broke out, he was making dua for them. He was aware of them. And, these type of things happening, yes. But in terms of does that the Ismail Agha Jamaat, does it have a presence in the Caucasus? That I do not know.
And in terms of it just came to my mind when Imam al-Kawthari is interesting that someone who is not ethnically a Turk can become the deputy Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire, the whole empire itself. They appoint someone. So it does denote some meritocracy there. It wasn't just putting people into positions because they're rated to somebody. It's actually on the merit as well.
Yes. If you look at, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire must be a Turk, right? But anyone under than that, it's not a condition. Even Shaykh Mustafa Sabri Effendi, rahimahullah, who is, essentially the superior to Shaykh Muhammad al-Kawthari. I remember Dr. Salah Abul Hajj, he mentioned in one of his talks that even Shaykh Mustafa Sabri, rahimahullah, admitted that Shaykh Muhammad Zahid al-Kawthari, rahimahullah, was more knowledgeable than him, right? Even though he technically had a higher official position, he did concede that Imam Muhammad Zad al-Kawthar rahimahullah was more knowledgeable. And both of them, as we know, were instrumental in defending Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah against these foreign modernist ideas that people try to use to dilute the religion.
Jazakallah khairan. Thank you very much for that. That was very enlightening and very, very interesting.
Thank you for having me.
No,
Jazakallah khairan.
there was one final question was Shaykh Meurad actually works with Safina Society. He works for Dr. Shadi al-Masri. So if you want to find his lessons, you can go to Safina Society. I think ArcView. You're on ArcView, aren't you?
Yes.
And some of the other platforms for Safina Society. So you can find more of their programs there, and Shaykh Meurad teaching on their programs. If I could just request a dua to close this gathering, please, that would be appreciated.
الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا طيبا مباركا فيه على كل حال حمدا يوافي نعمه يكافئ مزيده وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أجمعين. اللهم إنا نسألك بأن لك الحمد لا إله إلا أنت وحدك لا شريك لك الحنان المنان بديع السماوات والأرض ذو الجلال والإكرام يا حي يا قيوم إنا نسألك من خير ما سألك منه محمد نبيك ورسولك صلى الله عليه وسلم ونعوذ بك من شر ما استعاذك منه محمد نبيك ورسولك صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم إنا نسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في ديننا ودنيانا وأهلنا ومالنا. Ya Rabb, we ask that you please grant us whatever good your messenger, your beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked for from any of all of your goodness, and we ask you to protect us from every evil your beloved messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam sought your protection from, and we ask that you please grant us well-being and happiness and health and stability in all of our religious and worldly affairs, and to bless Ustaz Salih and all the listeners and all the people who attended, and to grant this ummah victory and peace and forgiveness and happiness and salvation in this dunya and the hereafter. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
All right, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you very much for your time.
وإياك.
Inshallah, for those in attendance, please look up Shaykh Meurad on Safina Society and please benefit from him and his programs. Okay, Jazakallah khairan and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.